All right, everybody. This is the first time I've had three guests on. I'm very, very excited for the three that I got. These are some very, very intelligent minds on the foreign policy front, much, much smarter than me. So, hell, that's why they're here. So, I got Connor, Kyle, and Pat all from antiwar.com, right?
Well, I'm from the Libertarian Institute. Kyle's from both, and Pat's from the Libertarian Institute as well.
Oh, okay, man, I really
But
boogered that up already.
we get articles and things up on antiwar.com and shows too. So
Cool. All right. Well, let's get a brief introduction from everybody. We'll start with Connor and then Kyle and Pat, and then we'll kind of get rocking and rolling here on what this one's all about.
yeah, sure. So I'm Connor Freeman. I'm a writer at the Libertarian Institute. I co-host Conflicts of Interest with Kyle and Will Porter, and I mean that's pretty much. I write pretty much exclusively on foreign policy, and I mean that's kind of my thing. That's more or less my bio.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm Kyle Anslone, opinion editor at antiwar.com, news editor at the Libertarian Institute. I co-host Conflicts of Interest with Connor. At the News Roundup, or at the Institute now, I'm dropping a whole bunch of news stories every day. And so we just put out one on a Texas prosecutor who was clerking for a judge, writing jury instructions in a case he was the prosecutor for, and put a guy on death row. So yeah, check that out.
Yeah, Patrick Mcfarland. I'm a practicing attorney. I have my own law practice in Wisconsin. I handle criminal law and family law, but I also host the Liberty Weekly podcast, have since about 2017. And I'm also a writer at the Libertarian Institute, where the Liberty Weekly podcast is also featured there. And then Connor, I know you said this, but yeah, our writing has appeared on antiwar.com. So as long as I can hang my hat on that hook, I will do it, because it's such a huge honor.
Yeah, so we kind of got a whole libertarian circle jerk here where one hand kind of feeds the other. So the reason I wanted to have you guys on is because with the rise of the paleos and this kind of new right, if you will, we've been hearing a lot about China, and Trump was, kind of famous for China. And, it comes from China, the whole deal with COVID-19. And it seems like over the last 2 years, we've just been beaten over the head with this from guys who are seemingly good on a lot of issues. But then as soon as you say China, these guys just go absolutely nuts. So we can kind of go in the same order that we started with. I wanted to kind of give the devil its due, per se, and let's kind of talk about the actual threat of China, and then where it may be a little bit overblown. So Connor, go ahead, kind of start off wherever here.
Well, I mean, as far as U.S. relations with China, I think, pretty much they don't really pose any threat to us, certainly militarily. One of the main problems, though, is you have, a massive American empire in the Asia Pacific. And we're building a permanent forward base in Southeast Asia. In particular, Obama launched something called the Asia Pivot in 2011, which was being agitated for at the turn of this century by groups like Project for a New American Century, the Robert Kagans and Bill Kristols of the world. And essentially, the U.S., since the end of the Cold War, has had a policy of maintaining global hegemony, which is a fancy way of saying world empire and domination. And so one of the main things as far as the Asia Pivot, and you can trace it back to even, like I said, some of the PNAC documents, they want to position 2/3 of all air and naval forces in that region to essentially contain China's rise to becoming, a great power itself. And this is more codified in under Trump's administration, which is, they have the national security strategy of, great power competition with Russia and China. So in the midst of that, we have inserted ourselves into sort of the disputes over, various most largely uninhabited islands, islets, archipelagos, and features in the South China Sea, where there are, myriad overlapping claims between all the different countries there. But we, starting with particularly Trump's State Department, led by Mike Pompeo, have rejected all those claims. And so this actually started under Obama's administration at the agitation of the military establishment and people like John McCain to sail warships through there on things we call freedom of navigation operations. And we claim that we're building, we all we want is like a free and open Indo-Pacific. But in the meantime, what we've done is militarize the whole region. More recently, sort of undermine the non-proliferation regime there with these alliances or military pacts like AUKUS with Australia, the UK, and the US, and providing nuclear submarine technology to Australia. And we've largely begun to encircle China with our allies now increasingly, including European allies like Germany, Britain, and even we've had the Canadians now sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait. But for the most part, I'll just say that as far as like the military situation, which gets built up by a lot of these hawks you're talking about, or just the sort of the paleo thing, it's kind of argued that like China is trying to become the most powerful military in the world. But in fact, what pretty explicitly is going on is they are really building up enough of a force to counter U.S. intervention and allied intervention in their near abroad. I mean, they actually call their foreign policy their anti-access area denial. So because we refuse to, stop, this Asia pivot, and it gets worse and worse under each administration. I mean, we had 2,000, spy planes and warplanes flying around these waters, South China Sea, East China Sea, Yellow Sea last year, just by November. We have put ourselves in a situation where, especially, using the Taiwan issue as a way to heighten tensions and send more and more military assets into the region to the island itself. And now it's open that we have troops on the island. We have inserted ourselves unnecessarily into kind of an escalation ladder, I would say, with China. And this is explicit. I mean, Joe Biden said in his first congressional address, he goes, we will, militarize the Asia Pacific region the same way we do with NATO in Eastern Europe. And so, I mean, as you can see how that's worked out in Eastern Europe, given everything going on now, it's a very, very bad situation. But as far as, I mean, the stuff about, generally, I would just say that, a lot of the stuff we hear from the hawks is that, Chinese companies steal our intellectual property. I don't know that that's necessarily a concern of like the American people. That sounds like more of American corporations' concern, and really not any of our business or a reason to heighten tensions between these states. There's a lot of talk about human rights abuses, and Pat's the expert in our movement on the whole, the Uyghur genocide claims, which are unfounded. Or just not true. Not to say that there's not repression going on in that region, but there's no proof that it's an actual genocide. But again, we have a hell of a lot of human rights abuses that we're responsible for abroad and here at home. So it's they come up with any number of issues to try and scare the American people. But for the most part, I think this is an excuse to build up, to have a new enemy to justify, $1 trillion year plus military budgets.
Cool. Yeah, that's a whole hell of a lot that we have to kind of, go on there and unpack. Like I said, it just seems like over the last couple of years, this just continues to rise and rise and rise. So, Kyle, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll let Pat weigh in on the Uyghur stuff, because I know he's really good on that issue.
Yeah.
But the one thing I guess, I can add that maybe China does deserve criticism for is, like they do like the same thing the U.S. does with the IMF, with their Belt and Road Initiative, and some of these infrastructure products and loans they're giving to some developing countries are predatory. They have I think now they have one, they are looking at a second military base in Africa. The first one being just down the road from the US base in Djibouti. And now I think they're looking at putting a second one in Equatorial Guinea. And so, I mean, these aren't good things that China is doing. I mean, it just feels silly to point it out and be like bad China when the US is doing it 10 to 20 times more. But it's worth pointing out that they've done things like they'll really put pressure on some smaller governments, like some of the Pacific Island governments, to change the flag on the airport for Taiwan to the Chinese flag and things like that. So, you know, that kind of diplomatic pressure is bad, and China does it.
I gotcha. Yeah. And we're kind of seeing this with the news right now, where if you're anti-war with Russia, then you must be pro-Putin, kind of like in the early 2000s, where if you don't want to go terrorize the Middle East, then you were pro-Saddam, or, you know, whatever it was back then. And, you know, we could say like, hey, China, some of the stuff that they're doing is definitely not good, but like there's just no reason to have this hot war with them. So I was listening to Tim Pool. I know that's Pat's favorite person in the world. I was listening to the China Uncensored episode, and we're hearing a lot about organ harvesting and this Uyghur genocide. And they're Uyghur Muslims, which is funny because a lot of the political right, they're okay with killing people in the Middle East because, you know, they're animals over there and they hate us for our freedom. So it's fine if we kill them. But though, if China's killing Uyghurs, then all of a sudden now we have to, you know, protest about this, even though we're enabling a genocide in Yemen. So Pat, kind of touch on that a little bit, because as the guys here said, and, you know, you're the kind of go-to guy on the Uyghur genocide claim and criticizing Tim Pool.
Yeah, well, it's a really complex issue just from the outset, and it's really hard. It's a nuanced position that you have to hold, because at the same time, the most common accusation you'll get is that you're a genocide denier, or that you support the Chinese Communist Party, or like, oh, you don't trust governments at all, so why would you trust what the Chinese government says? And so I guess recently my thinking has really kind of evolved in that, well, I don't think that you should automatically discount something a government says just because the government says it. You just have to think kind of beyond that. So, but to kind of frame the issues, is the Uyghurs are a Turkic Muslim population that inhabit the far western province of China. It's called the Xinjiang region. In Chinese, Xinjiang means new frontier. There's been a lot of historical animosity and conflict between the Uyghur population and the Han ethnic group. And so there's a history more recently of terrorism that it has taken root in that area, and it has the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, very concerned. In a lot of ways, the concerns parallel our own war on terror. So it's not saying that the Chinese Communist Party is justified, but it's just kind of going into what their motivations and concerns are in the situation. So the way that they frame this is that they openly admit that there are facilities there. I don't know if you want to call them re-education facilities. That statement is a loaded term with historical implications. But the way that they frame it is that there are facilities there. Uyghurs are being sent there, but they're being sent there for like job training and things like that. It does appear that some people have been sentenced there. And if you read Peter Lee, we just ran a piece on the Libertarian Institute. He does say there is evidence that of a cultural change there, that people are being sent there to get rid of their Uyghur culture and to send them back into society. And that's definitely not something that I would endorse. And in fact, I think that's pretty horrible. But at the same time, for instance, like when the entire world is accusing Saddam Hussein of having weapons of mass destruction, are we really going to sit there and talk about how horrible of a dictator Saddam Hussein is? And you know, looking in our backyard, we have our own problems, as was already mentioned by Kyle and Connor. So that really is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Uyghur issue. But there's so many different aspects to it. There's the Adrian Zenz aspect. He's a German sociologist, think tanker, who has published papers accusing the Chinese Communist Party of genocide against the Uyghurs. I think even he openly admits that the Uyghur population is not falling, that it's just the growth rate in their population has changed. And it turns out that his research was based on shoddy math, and he attributes the genocide to what is a change in family planning and a shifting in the one-child policy, because it never applied to the Uyghurs until 2018. So we have that aspect of it. We have the phony and faulty institutions like the New Line Institute that publishes one of like the bumper study on it. We have defectors that come forward with eyewitness testimony of atrocities whose stories don't line up and who have connections to the National Endowment for Democracy and the World Uyghur Congress. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's the whole Falun Gong aspect. And you mentioned China Uncensored. And China Uncensored has connections to New Tang Dynasty and the Falun Gong, and the Epoch Times are all kind of these sibling organizations of Falun Gong, which is a religious group. Some people have accused it of being a cult. I don't necessarily endorse that view, but they do state their motivations pretty openly and outwardly, is that they are against the Chinese Communist Party. All of these accusations of organ harvesting really kind of boil down to them. And they've been making these accusations for a long time because they were ousted from China in the 90s and fled to the United States and have had a real vendetta against the Chinese Communist Party since then. So that's kind of the issue in a nutshell. And I try and do it justice in sound bites, but it really is an issue that is too complex for, just a 2-minute synopsis.
Right. And we hear all the right wingers, you name the right winger right now. They're so good on actually a majority of issues on the Middle East about, all these foreign interventions. But then all of a sudden you bring up the dirty China word. Once again, now they all turn back. It sounds like Bill Kristol, right? They're almost inseparable. So it kind of frustrates me because you want to kind of side with these people and take the wins where you can get them. But then all of a sudden they say, well, we should stop all these wars in the Middle East because we need to focus on China. So as we're recording it, it's February 24th of 2022. And, we're having a little bit of issues in Ukraine, to say the least. And a lot of people are talking about potential issue in Taiwan. And I think I saw an article saying that China was flying ships over, doing something near Taiwan. So maybe we kind of go around and explain why we might have interest in Taiwan and what it might look like if something were to break out there. So I guess, Connor, start off. Why does America have any kind of interest in defending Taiwan should something happen?
There's the whole history of the war between the nationalists and the communists after the Second World War, where the nationalists lost and fled to Taiwan. Essentially the American Navy stopped the communists from taking the island and reclaiming control over it. And from then on until about 1979. The American government policy was to recognize the Republic of China as basically, the Chiang Kai-shek government as being the rightful rulers of all China. And then in 1979, we de-recognized Taiwan and recognized the Beijing government as being the rightful rulers of the country, and enacted a policy called strategic ambiguity, where it's really unclear whether or not we would intervene to defend Taiwan in the event of a war, and that we oppose any reunification by anything other than peaceful means. So it's meant to maintain, peace and stability, they say, across the strait. And it basically did for a very long time. In fact, there was a policy, the great Gareth Porter has a piece about how American diplomats had a policy called dual deterrence that goes back to the early 90s, where if Taiwanese officials, heads of state got too out of hand in getting close to declaring their independence, which would trigger a major crisis across the strait, the Americans would intervene and use their leverage with Taiwan to stop that, and also maintain a level of deterrence with China, where it's like, hey, basically standing in between them and saying, okay, Taiwan, you calm down and don't start anything, and China, don't mess with Taiwan because you don't know what we're liable to do, and we may come to their defense, and this could be a serious war. but at some point that changed during the Obama administration, and it really was in service of the Asia pivot and this new Cold War that we see now with under, I mean, I usually blame the neoconservatives, but we're really talking about them and their liberal interventionist analogs. And what we have now is a Cold War against Russia and China concurrently, instead of, the old realist position in the Cold War balancing one against the other. So, and again, this justifies ever increasing military budgets, regardless of what party's in power and what administration we see. Now, as far as the Taiwan thing goes, like why it's so important to like American military dominance is because the idea that the hawks talk about is if we didn't intervene to defend Taiwan, and if China were to take the country back by force, which there's a lot of reasons to believe that China doesn't intend to do that, or would only do that as a very last resort. But the idea is that if we didn't intervene, then it would jeopardize our security architecture in the region, and that Japan and Korea and other states there would not feel that they could depend on us, the Philippines, to come to their defense in the event of conflict with China. And then the Bill Cristols of the world were warned that, as he did in the debate with Scott Horton, that, oh, then they're all going to go for nukes, and it's going to be chaos and this sort of thing. So, but I mean, I also believe that Taiwan is seen as a vehicle to basically build an American aircraft carrier off China's coast in the form of the island of Taiwan. And also, I mean, we see lawmakers proposing bills that would guarantee Taiwan, billions of dollars in aid every year from the Americans. And it also serves to gin up tensions with China, like I say, to justify further expansion into the region and to contain China. I mean, it's literally their greatest excuse for the Asia pivot, which is why, I think it's very hypocritical. You mentioned Tim Pool. I always think of the moment in his interview with Scott when he essentially pisses himself every day about Taiwan, right? And so he mentions that he believes the Abraham Accords are these monumental peace deals that Trump accomplished. And a lot of these sort of America First people like Joe Kent parrot that same rhetoric, which is completely false. But nevertheless, Scott says to him, well, wait a minute, let's fight about the Abraham Accords. He goes, they're encircling Iran. It's just a bunch of welfare for the military industrial complex. And they throw the Palestinians under the bus and subjugate them to continuing apartheid and occupation. And Tim Pool goes, why should I care about Palestine? So it's so hypocritical. And I think to your point, a lot of these right wingers use it as an excuse to gin up the tensions with China and to get people really scared and to, fuel acceptance or enthusiasm about this new Cold War and this Asia pivot in sort of a new way, instead of, it being Obama talking about a free and open Indo-Pacific and this sort of thing. I mean, it just kind of works on, it works to make people think that there's a war that we should fight to defend to defend people and be like heroes again, as they, the idea being that like we were in World War II. So we hold military exercises out there in that region that are, the largest naval exercises in the Pacific since the World War II era. And as you said about the air defense identification zone, that's a very useful propaganda tactic because the air defense identification zone is not recognized under international law. Taiwan's air defense identification zone extends thousands of miles into mainland China. So as Peter Van Buren will point out, you could have planes just sitting on their runways in China, technically violating Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And actually, when those planes go through, for the most part, they're usually, about 100 miles or more away from the island itself. So there's a lot of hyperbole involved in trying to scare the American people into thinking, here's somebody else we have to come and defend. And to your, I'll just say, I mean, it's also, hypocritical when they, because again, I mean, people like Joe Kent, who support the Abraham Accords, this idea that they want to defend Taiwan and that China is horrible to their Muslims, these policies that they endorse actually cement American involvement in the Middle East. And they're usually actually not all that great on the Middle East when you look at, like, you know, how many of them oppose removing sanctions on countries like Syria or ending the military occupation there, or you know, using leverage with Israel to stop their weekly bombings of the country. And we just saw recently, Kyle wrote a great article about it. You know, Tim Pool had a guest on. I'm sort of blanking on his name, frankly, but he's running for
Mills.
There you go. He's a former Trump DOD appointee. He's running for Congress, I believe, in Florida. And, you know, he justifies the genocide you referred to earlier in Yemen. And it's indefinite continuation because he points to the great Iranian boogeyman and falsely portrays the Houthis as Iranian proxies. So, you know, these guys, they put out kind of like, you know, rhetoric that is transparent often, but it's meant to sort of lure people in who want to be on the right side of these issues, but then they kind of funnel them off into a anti-China position, which is very convenient because, you know, I mean, the national security strategy is no longer, since Trump anyway, they no longer really focus on, or they do, but ostensibly the idea is that we're seconding, you know, counterterrorism operations in North Africa and the Middle East in favor of focusing on the new great threats, which are Russia and China.
Yeah, and moreover, to jump in here, they people like Tim Pool, they get good libertarians on and make them appear to be China hawks, or they get people on who are libertarians who aren't really that great on China and who endorse these ideas that he seems to feed to them. And I don't know if it's because they don't know what they're talking about and they just kind of nod and agree, or if they don't want to, like, you know, Tim Pool's doing me a favor by giving me a platform, so I'm not going to rock the boat and call him out on this stuff. So I think it's a complicated thing, but it really concerns me to have otherwise good libertarians go on and endorse this hawkishness.
So it was funny when Pete Quinones was on there, and
not Pete.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah. But he had started mentioning, like, hey, dude, China's not really that much of a, you know, economic powerhouse as they may want you to believe. Like 30% of their agriculture is still done by hand, and like the entire room went completely silent. And the point just went like right over Tim's head, and they moved on to something else. Kyle, you got anything to add?
Yeah, so just real quick on the Taiwan issue, you mentioned there were, I think, 9 Chinese planes that entered the Taiwanese ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, and that did happen within a few hours of, you know, Russia's incursion into Ukraine. It's not exactly clear to me that the two are necessarily related, although they, you know, it could have been like on China's part, like did at the same time to like maybe make a point or something. I don't know, but it wasn't a threat in any way to, you know, actual Taiwan or anything. Taiwan's ADIZ, if you look at a map of Taiwan and zoom out enough where you could see the Philippines, it actually splits. Like, you know, Taiwan's ADIZ goes all the way to the Philippines and they meet in the middle. And oftentimes the where the Chinese flights are, in these particular flights were in that area. And so it's not, you know, exactly like even in any way all that provocative. But at the same time, Taiwan is not a country. Important point, and that is official enshrined in U.S. law that we have a one China policy. That means one government for mainland China and Taiwan, and the U.S. recognizes that government as the CCP. This is U.S. law. Now, you know, it is an independent entity and does have its own independent government, and it is somewhat wealthy. And so it's an absolutely great, you know, piece for the military industrial complex because Taiwan has its own money. But then also we could pour in military aid and help them finance all the military sales and everything like that. And it's located next to a, you know, China, which on the map is a big, but also just in reality, I think if China really wanted to, they could fight a war and take back Taiwan. I don't think there's a whole lot the U.S. could do about it if China really wanted to, just like the U.S. couldn't do a whole lot about Ukraine when Russia really wanted to go in. It's just, you know, if if Mexico or if China and Russia did everything they could to prevent the US from taking Mexico City, it wouldn't matter. Right. It's too close to the United States. I mean, I guess they could go war with the US. We could go to war with Russia or China or something like that. But we actually can't, just prevent China from taking Taiwan. It won't happen. But at the same time, there's really no indication that China is anywhere near the point where they're looking for a military action to retake Taiwan. They've I guess, officially dropped that, they're looking for peaceful reunification. Now they just say, we're looking for reunification, but, that's, I think, a pretty broad thing to still for for China's official policy to be. I think Connor already mentioned Peter Van Buren, former U.S. diplomat to the region, and he explains that, look, these are all countrymen. These are all, Han Chinese, are, Han for the most part, and, of Chinese descent. These are people who were a part of the Chiang Kai-shek's government and fled to Taiwan, right? So they are kind of all still countrymen in that way. There's less of an incentive to fight a war, and there would just be there's a lot of time between now and any war over Taiwan, and so it's really perfect for the military-industrial complex, right? Because then there's constantly a crisis, there's constantly a need to make sure that Taiwan has more weapons so it could defend itself from China, which, in since the invasion is probably never coming, it makes it very easy, right? And so I think that's really the role that Taiwan is currently playing in the US empire, is it helps to, demonize China, and it's just a perfect place to pour in weapons.
Right. It kind of seems like this was such a hot button topic. And I've kind of thought about it this way, is that kind of the political left will use racism as a tool to beat, their voters and people into submission. And the right will kind of use China as the same deal. Like, oh, China's going to take your job, or, there's systemic racism all around you and we have to do something to fix it. So it's kind of like selling you the problem so that way we can have something to fix. And we're kind of seeing this with Ukraine too, right? So we know that the whole deal where we overthrew Ukraine in 2014 with literal Nazis and, Joe Biden's fingerprints are all over Ukraine. And now all of a sudden that we've continued to kind of poke the bear with Russia and continue to, kind of mess around Ukraine right on Russia's doorstep. When they finally get pissed off and do something, we're surprised. And it seems like we're doing something similar with Taiwan when, Kyle, you had said that we're kind of sending them weapons. So any one of you guys kind of take it from there. But, it kind of seems like we constantly do this selling of the problem. We sit here and arm another country, and then all of a sudden their neighbors are like, hey, what the hell are you doing? And then we're surprised when something finally happens. So, do you guys think that what is China's interest in actually going and taking over Taiwan? And do you guys really see that as all likely? I know, Kyle, you kind of said it didn't seem all that likely, but do you think that if we continue to kind of do the same deal that we're doing in Ukraine, do you think that's a possibility?
Well, yeah, I think it's a possibility in the long run that way. If the US continues to say that, we're going to defend Taiwan and recognize Taiwan as an independent country, I think that is going to provoke China into seeking a military solution faster. I think ideally for China, what they would like to have happen is for some kind of political reunification, diplomatic reunification with Taiwan, because it's a lot cheaper. It's expensive as hell to wage a war. I'm sure that this is going to cost Putin. I mean, the military buildup alone, just moving all the troops into the region, probably costs hundreds of millions, if not more. But when you're looking at, actually carrying out these military operations, and then, the trade-offs when soldiers start coming home in body beds and everything like that, this is a massive cost. And so if you could have reunification in a way that doesn't involve military action, then yeah, I do think China wants that. And if it was like on the table tomorrow, I think they would take it. You know what I mean? Like it's a very real concern, and it's a very real issue for China. Taiwan is a part of China, according to China. And I think the Taiwanese perspective, now I don't know how much this is the case with like the current Taiwanese government or anything, but I think like historically, for as long as this kind of been its own thing, that they viewed likewise one China, and they just thought that they should be the ones that controlled the whole thing, right? And so I guess all that plays into it. Now, yeah, I do see this thing that the U.S. government is doing, and the Chets are really like, we can't cash them, right? So we promise all these countries things that we can't follow through on. So we promise Ukraine that we'll defend their territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we'll put them on the path to NATO membership. They're never going to be members of NATO. Yeah, I would have said this a week ago before this happened too. And they're never going to be able to defend themselves, and the US was never going to defend them. All those things happened, right? Same thing with the Afghan government. I feel like in a lot of ways the US kind of like led them on about how much support they were going to get, and then once it left, it's like, and so, yeah, this is a possibility for Taiwan as well, that if the U.S. does go far enough rhetorically and pushes China to believe that the only way that they will ever get Taiwan back is to immediately invade, then yeah. And especially if the U.S. starts talking about putting like upgraded weapons and things like that in Taiwan, that might start to push China's hand, right? If they think that Taiwan's going to have Patriot missiles, they're going to, get a lot more interested in making sure that doesn't happen.
Right. So I've also heard a lot about geographically, China is not really set up to kind of take over Taiwan because they're surrounded by people who aren't particularly fond of them. So anyone can kind of grab this one. Do you guys kind of want to lay out that dynamic and explain why China may not, it's just not exactly advantageous for them to kind of go on any kind of military adventure currently?
Well, primarily, I've talked about this before, and I've kind of downplayed the possibility that China would take Taiwan in the past. I think one of the big things is that I think there was a big article in Politico about it, about exactly how the manpower and resources that would be required to take over Taiwan would just be immense. Like, this article put forward like D-Day times 5, like over 1 million soldiers you might need to take the island. The coastline that faces China is rocky. There aren't a lot of good landing places and beachheads. And you have a Taiwanese population that has been preparing for war for decades. Now, on the other hand, you have Lyle Goldstein, and there was a great interview that he did with Scott Horton a few months ago during hunting season, because I was hunting when I listened to it, I think November. But he was talking, he's the director at Defense Priorities, the director for Asia engagement. And he's former Navy intelligence. And he was saying that he thinks that China would be able to take Taiwan in a couple days with coordinated covert ops or like little squads of special forces and targeted bombardments. And I think that what we're seeing in Ukraine, I mean, honestly, to me, I'm kind of reevaluating how I look at things, because I didn't particularly think that Putin would invade Ukraine or conduct military actions in it the way that we see it now. But I think we see with Putin's, I don't know how you want to classify it, the operation into Ukraine is a very targeted precision strike operation. And if China could do that in Taiwan and use special forces to cut the head off the snake and do something like that, I think it's a real possibility. But I would take Lyle Goldstein's opinion very seriously.
Yeah, and I'll add that the U.S. makes this infinitely more likely the more and more it sends, upgraded F-16s and, AGM-84E missiles that can hit, deep inland targets. This started under Trump in particular. We're helping them build their own submarine fleet. The other thing too is you have acts in Congress on the, that are, they haven't been passed yet, but I mean, things like the Defending, I almost said the Defending Ukraine Sovereignty Act. It's the Preventing Taiwan Invasion Act, which is essentially, it's supported by Elaine Luria, who is this very hawkish Democrat from Virginia, representative, but it was put forward by Republicans. And basically what it does is it overturns the constitutional authority on, war declaration, and says to Biden, if we pass this, we give you a blank check. You can declare war on China if Taiwan is threatened, because we don't want to have to wait to go to war with China. So if they make a move, let's just go to war without ever voting on it. I mean, not that we vote on war anymore, but there's also a concurrent push by people like Tom Cotton and other hawks who push a policy, Richard Haas at the Council on Foreign Relations, who push things like, we should just switch to the policy to strategic clarity and say, we'll go to war with China, if they attack Taiwan. And, we sail warships to the Taiwan Strait every month. As I said, Biden has increased the military provocations. We had aircraft carrier strike groups in, the South China Sea. We sent 10 times last year, which is almost double what Trump did in 2020. And again, the warplanes and the spy planes flying around the area more than doubled between Trump in 2020 and Biden in 2021. The Chinese Defense Ministry was pointing that out as early as April. They were saying that the number of warships had increased by, I believe, 20%, and the number of war planes flying around had increased by 40%. So, also, China is surrounded by, it's not like they have a bunch of allies surrounding them. They have about a 1,400-mile border with India, and that border, especially in the Western Himalayas, is unstable. There have been some major scuffles where dozens of people have been killed, not with bullets, but they beat each other to death. They've had recent volatile relations and violent incidents with Vietnam. North Korea is an unstable neighbor. South Korea, Japan, Okinawa. You've got all that American military aircraft, ready to just decimate China's air force in the event of any kind of a conflict. And we're continuing. We have the Quad, which is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is really a fig leaf for kind of bringing a NATO-style anti-China alliance into the region. If you look at NATO's Project 2030, I think it's called Vision 2030 or something like that. They declared a year or two ago that China is a major threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which seems absurd. But again, these are, like you said, people who are selling you problems that they already have the solution to. And as Kyle said, if they actually moved on Taiwan, my hope is that, as bad as that might look, and again, I don't think, with barring further U.S. intervention and provocation and our emboldening of Taiwan's pro-separatist forces and the more hawkish elements in their government, building up all these lines. You hear things from Australian politicians where they say, we're going to be at war with China in 5 to 10 years. We're getting ready for that right now. That's why we're, buying all these. That's why we need these subs. You have people like Steve Bannon running around with his Committee on the Present Danger China think tank with Frank Gaffney saying, I think 5 years ago or 6 years ago, he said we're going to be at war in the South China Sea in 5 to 10 years. Tucker Carlson said to Tulsi Gabbard recently, he goes, going to war with Russia over Ukraine is absurd. It's insane. We could all die in a nuclear war. There are interests, though, that we would have to fight over. Absolutely. Like shipping lanes in the South China Sea. So, but I guess, I'm sort of going off on that tangent. But I mean, as far as the China thing, we are building a powder keg there. And, but, at the same time, there's so much trade going on between China and Taiwan. China is Taiwan's greatest trade partner. There's, they have about, over the last 30 years, nearly $200 billion invested in China. The cross-strait trade is like at $150 billion. And Peter Van Buren, the formerly mentioned Peter Van Buren, has written a series of articles for the American Conservative about this that are very, very good. And he's, he does not believe that this is likely to happen. I mean, he talks about how, the Chinese Navy has 3 of these Type 075 ships that can only, hold 1,000 men. And they need, as Pat said, 1 million people or more to take the island. And Taiwan has anti-ship missiles that can have like a 60-mile range, and they're getting closer and closer to fielding a 200-mile anti-ship missile. But again, as I said, I mean, the goal is to build a military force that can contain China and fight this inevitable massive naval battle. And there are people in our society, in the think tanks, even in the independent media, who are salivating at the prospects of this. And it's just, it's a very insidious thing because it's much more bipartisan than people realize. I mean, really, the Democrats, namely Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton, were really leading it in the last 10 years or so. I mean, Trump became more synonymous with it because he was more outwardly anti-China, but the policy existed before he came in. He just expanded it. And then Biden, again, has just, doubled it, and maybe he's probably going to triple it. I mean, the risks at this point are, I mean, Biden has said, like, we are in extreme competition with China. We are going to win the 21st century. On my watch, they will never become, this most powerful country. And they're really not. I mean, their economy has got myriad problems with it. They've got all kinds of demographic issues. I think they have less arable land per capita than Saudi Arabia. They're the world's greatest food importer. In the event of a war and international isolation, they would be in very, very, very bad shape. And they have a lot of, because of the one-child policies and the restrictions on childbirth, they have a huge problem of young men who will never be married, just waiting to essentially revolt if there's ever a major crisis like that. And they know all of this. And I mean, they've got horrible health problems when you look at the pollution and the diabetes issues, their real estate bubble, the corruption, the fact that most of those massive infrastructure projects will never make as much money in returns as they cost to build in the first place. And but it serves as this wonderful, wonderful boogeyman to sell the American people on. And there's really no reason for us to go to war with them. They have, we have $1 trillion invested there. They have, I believe, somewhere around $150 billion invested in America. But there's a strong push in, particularly coming up now in American right-wing politics, to push for a decoupling either gradually or suddenly. And I'll just point out that there is a heavy influence by people like Peter Thiel, who supports people like Joe Kent and Blake Masters, who are very popular with these libertarian paleos you've talked about. And they are very enthusiastic. They don't even necessarily have to come out and say it, but they'll say things to you like, if you watch Blake Masters commercials, I don't understand exactly why paleos are so into him. Maybe because he throws out nice sentiments about, the Federal Reserve and inflation and this kind of thing. And that's great. But it's got to, the costs outweigh the benefits greatly. He talks about how we need to be making our own, semiconductors and our own antibiotics. And then you have Joe Ken, who comes and he says, China is a threat to Taiwan and they're going to be at war with Taiwan, sort of assuming the sale. And then you have people like Joe Kent who are talking about, actually decoupling. I mean, he says it's should be the number one national security priority is decoupling with China. And he talks about how we're already at war with China and we need to build a coalition of nations to confront them over their genocide of the Uyghur Muslims and launch, he doesn't think we have sanctioned China nearly enough. And of course, Biden hasn't lifted the tariffs. So, and the Democrats are not good on this issue. They're really not. I mean, again, it's unfortunate. It's kind of like Iran or even the Russia situation. There just isn't a sizable contingent because the left that we all know and love, that we read at antiwar.com and Consortium News, et cetera, does not really have a voice in American Democratic Party politics. And truthfully, there's this problem you see with people like Bernie Sanders is a great example, or Trump, or these guys I'm talking about now, where they're nominally good on certain issues, but they're very bad in foreign policy in certain areas. And so, I guess I'm just saying that the war becomes, exponentially more likely because less people are afraid actually to push back on this stuff. It's a very, I'm glad we're doing this show because frankly, libertarians seem to be very reluctant. And I don't know if it's because they believe that the new right it could be great allies of ours and we could build this wonderful coalition and it would be so based. I don't understand. It's a poison pill and it needs to be addressed soon because it's one of these things like with Russia where, it's much easier, unfortunately, to say, enough of the endless wars in the Middle East. Unfortunately, the American people never get bored enough or sick enough of them to make sure that they're done and that we get our troops out of the region, that we lift sanctions and stop occupying these countries. But they say, we're not interested in that anymore. We want to focus on bigger things, like going to war with Russia and China. And that's becoming more and more prevalent.
Right. And it definitely seems so. So, Pat, do you have something to add there?
I think I don't know. I think it really just kind of boils down to what your priorities are. I mean, I think, and Kyle and Connor and I have talked about this before on shows, is that libertarians, I mean, anti-war is the most important issue. At least that's our North Star. And Connor, I think we have a group chat going, and Connor was saying earlier today that, and I agree with him, is that sometimes being anti-war comes first before being libertarian. And I agree with that, but I don't think the paleos would, because to them, all of a sudden in their issue hierarchy, the issue of fighting the COVID regime has catapulted to number one. And I'm not saying that's not important, but I'm saying that, nuclear annihilation is pretty damn important too.
Okay, so I'm really glad you brought that up. And a lot of people that I actually really like that I've been on this show, actually, and I'm not knocking these people, but they say, I don't care what your issues are. If you're good on the COVID regime, you got my support. And I'm like, well, maybe we should be a little bit more, not so myopic on this one thing. So, and that's not to say the COVID regime isn't a big deal, but like, if you have somebody that's literally saying, like a Ron DeSantis, who would essentially probably go to war with Iran because he's so pro-Israel and he's for all the foreign intervention, he's for all the NSA, the spying, everything that really made the last 20 years so bad, he's for, but he's good on COVID. So we could throw all that stuff to the side, but just because he's good on this one issue, okay, well, not that I'm saying COVID's gonna ever be over at a definable point, but should we really kind of sacrifice everything that we as libertarians have spoken out so loud against just to support this ending this one issue? I don't think that's a worthwhile trade.
It's not that we can't issue ally for, like, we can't, it's not that we shouldn't make single issue coalitions. It's just, do you want to wed yourself to this figure? You can praise them for being good on COVID stuff, but you call them out when they're bad. I don't think that's too hard of an ask.
Right. So I kind of got my balls busted about this because I was told, what do you mean by holding someone accountable? And it's like, okay, we can ally with people. Once again, and Ron Paul was all about this, about building coalitions. So we can ally with people in saying no to the COVID regime, but that doesn't mean we have to hop on board with everything. And this is kind of where I see a little bit of the flaw in the paleo movement, is that we're siding with a lot of people who are bad on a lot of stuff. And it's basically just, well, we want a seat at the table, so we'll throw aside a little bit of principles, which I can understand, but how much you want to chip away at that before you realize you're no different than Mitt Romney or John McCain. And I don't think a lot of the guys would get to that point, but if we're going to sit here and support people who are talking about going to war and saying that China's our greatest threat, those people need to be criticized. And if we're going to put our voices behind them, then we need to make sure that we have enough capital with these people that we can convince them that, like, look, we cannot do this. This is not a reasonable proposition at all.
I'll say it too, just briefly, that I don't think it's the greatest, just on a political basis, the greatest strategy to be like a lot of other people. Because if it's always bugged me that logically it doesn't make much sense to be like, I just want to go back to 2019. I just want to go back to 20. Like, well, then they'll just lock you down and take away all your rights again over something else, because all the problems, the foundation of what caused all this is already there. And the idea that, like, I know, like, I'm not trying to diminish the COVID regime at all, but I am saying that if you pick some issue like that and then, make the anti-war issue secondary or tertiary, first of all, I think that's just morally wrong, especially when we live in the empire and we're out in war in all these different countries and have the blood of millions on our hands. And, it's $1 trillion plus a year on all this mass murder. And it's the first thing we should stop. But at the same time, if you just take one issue and decide that if it's not that, that's the one. So we can be, because a lot of people, unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately, but the anti-COVID regime politics are shared by a lot of people on the right. So we would just be kind of like, it's almost like if you were to say in Ron Paul's era that, like, I like Ron Paul, but if you're against lower taxes, then you're on my side. Then you're on my side, like, regardless of whatever else. I understand the war, the war in Iraq is horrible, but taxes, that's the main issue for us right now, is we need to lower that. And then, meanwhile, it's just not a good strategy to me. I don't understand, because there's so much, especially these people we're talking about who are these kind of hawks in doves clothing. They are very adept at using those kind of, those issues that we have in common to exploit, the situation to kind of, like I said, poison pill our movement. And I think it's just unwise, because you have so many people that are, anti-lockdown and anti-vax mandate and all these things. And I am too. I'm not vaxxed. I hate the mask stuff. I'm totally, it's the corporate welfare was, and the restriction, the violations of civil liberties was one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. But during 2020, I mean, we started sailing aircraft carriers and warships and flying warplanes all over China's near abroad. And if you were reading antiwar.com, you could see this building and building and building. And it was terrifying. But at the same time, much of the left, much of the right, and much of libertarians just didn't talk about it. And now the problem has gotten much worse. It's kind of like how now everybody's paying attention to Ukraine. But like, if we'd been paying attention before and put a stop to all this, we would be in a much, much better situation, and we wouldn't be facing, because it's very possible. I mean, the reaction by Biden today is to double down on the policies that led us to the crisis and the current war ongoing in Ukraine. Maybe not sending arms now to Kiev, but I mean, sending more and more troops to the Eastern Europe and imposing more and more sanctions. And, so, I mean, unfortunately, this has to be addressed, because it does threaten to blow up the whole planet. And then your opposition to the COVID narrative won't really mean much at all.
Yeah, I think COVID will be the least of our issues if we have a hot nuclear war. So kind of tagging on to what Connor was saying earlier about China being a powder keg, their population probably isn't that happy with this whole one-child policy. And from what I understand, a lot of the men that are kind of enlisted in the military, they're like, we really aren't digging this stuff at all. And I think we have $1 trillion a year trade deficit with China, and we do lots and lots of trade with China. So Kyle, you can kind of lead from here. It just doesn't seem in our best interest to continue to push this issue with China, because right now we're benefiting from this trade relationship with China, right? All we got to do is print money, and then we buy stuff, and then all these boats come here, we get all these goods, and then these ships go back empty and clog our ports. They go back to China to bring us more stuff. Well, once again, we were told that we're losing on these trade deals, but if you really understand anything, and as I'm sure all of us are Austrian economists, or into the Austrian School of Economics, you could just see it doesn't make much logical sense to sit here and say that we're the losers here. So Kyle, kind of build on that and your thoughts surrounding that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure you're right on the economics. If they're just taking in our debt, we will have to pay for that one day. But for now, it is a good deal, and so, why push it? The people who talk about Chinese currency manipulation and everything like that, well, that really shouldn't be an issue for us. It's only an issue because they own so much of our debt. Although I really don't know a lot about it, and I don't know how much of an issue it is. But just on when we're talking about DeSantis and Trump and these people and things like that, it is worth remembering that all these people locked us down in the first place, right? If there was somebody out there who really never did lockdowns and really stood up the whole time and was bad on China, that would be one thing. But these people are obviously grifters, right? They only came to it once it became, it was like 60 minutes to force DeSantis into it by making up lies about him, making him look like he loved COVID. And like, like they literally drove him to become like more and more radical on this, the left-wing media. And so, that's really all you could count on these people for, is to react to the left-wing media. And I mean, to be honest, the left-wing media in this country is so raw and so often that isn't the worst thing to bet on, right? But at the same time, if you're placing your hopes in that person, well, then you are placing your hopes ultimately at the whims of the left-wing media, who drive what DeSantis and Trump do based on what they say about them, right? Like Trump's a total reactionary on this kind of stuff. Now he gets them a little bit too, I think, better than DeSantis, and they feed into each other. But so yeah, if you had, like, let's say Glenn Jacobs, who I know has been really good on this lockdown thing the whole time and everything like that. I don't know what his foreign policy positions are, but let's just say like he's kind of bad on China. He's like, yeah, we really can't trust them and we should just do business here and not there. Right. Okay, like that, that is tolerable. But for a real China hawk, no. And especially not somebody who's only faux good on this this lockdown stuff, which so many of these guys are. And that to me is the real problem. It's just like throwing hope at anyone. And then just on this group of people, you also have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I mean, it just, why is this one the people you're backing? And again, it's all about just reaction, right? If the lefties had been forcing everybody to walk into the chamber of Congress every time and take off their masks to show their face, should be dressing in a full burqa every day, it, right? And so it's like, again, if you're just putting all of your chips on the reactionaries, then you don't know what you're going to get. And that's my real problem with a lot of these people that the paleo seem to be betting on.
One of my big things is I'm working on a piece. Actually, I finished a piece that's waiting to be published about this, specifically on Ron DeSantis. Is that Ron DeSantis locked Florida down? Like, let's not forget that. So by his actions, he's telling us that he's willing to impose medical martial law. It's just that, again, Kyle made an excellent point that I'm going to have to add to that article. Thanks, Kyle. Was this time bullying him into a different position, man? Like he flipped on the COVID issue once the numbers came across, and he thought he could make a point saying, "Oh, it's not that bad." So it's like, I'm against lockdowns when the data doesn't support lockdowns. But if the data does support lockdowns, then I'm imposing medical martial law. And can you trust that person? I mean,
right. Well, this is kind of where I see a lot of weakness in this Florida strategy. And I love Tho Bishop, don't get me wrong, and I have a lot of respect for him. But this paleo approach and this King DeSantis is dependent on one person. And you're literally hoping that this person never loses. So it's kind of like going to the casino and putting all your chips on the table and hoping you don't lose. So, what happens if things go south? And I'm not saying it's likely, because people down in Florida fucking love DeSantis, but what happens if that goes wrong? What happens if, now all of a sudden Florida decides they want somebody blue because they say some good stuff about something that, just appeals to them, and all of a sudden they decide, okay, well, we want blue now. Well, now everything you just built, all the power you just gave your King DeSantis down there, is now in the hands of, a Democrat governor. Just think about kind of what you're doing there. And I understand none of this stuff is like done. Like, there's time, you need to have some kind of solution. And I agree it's working right now, but what's your long-term goal, and what does a long-term look like? Because I guarantee you Ron DeSantis isn't always going to be there. So who's going to be there to replace him? Is it going to be somebody good? I don't know. But, if you look somewhere like New Hampshire, it seems like they're going a little bit more of the systemic route, where they want to change things fundamentally. At least that's what I hear from some of the guys up there. I just haven't looked into it that much. But, I don't think staking your entire state's existence as being the great state of Florida on one person, no matter what, is a good bet.
And I know there's a lot of things other than that appealed to the paleos, other than DeSantis's COVID policy. And I'd be the first one to admit that I would have rather lived under DeSantis than lived under Tony Evers during all this. So I think there are some, concessions that can be made on that point. However, I think that my argument stands. Of course, I made it. I'd stand behind it.
Yeah, well, you know what? I live here in Pennsylvania, about 45 minutes north of Pittsburgh. So, yeah, I would have definitely rather lived in Florida. And this kind of goes to the point that I've been seeing a lot of people head on recently, where libertarians are mostly guilty of saying they're both the same, but they're honestly not. But to a degree, they are. But, once again, to the libertarians, they're saying they're all the same. Where would you have rather lived? Pennsylvania, New York, California, or Florida? Or what was it, South Dakota, where Nome was? I think everybody would, understandably say I would have rather lived somewhere that may have a little bit more boomer cons, but we would have freedom. I don't think that's a sin to say, although some people would agree that it is.
Well, if you don't agree, then you are definitely, you're a Lulbert, naive, autistic person. So
I brought up this point with one of these guys who I won't name, but I brought up the point that Blake Masters' policies about China and this decoupling, in the absence of any discussion about the Asia pivot, make war vastly more likely. And I suggested that his connection, he's received, so he's the COO at Thiel Capital. Peter Thiel founded Palantir, which is a CIA contractor. It was funded with CIA money from In-Q-Tel. Now, Palantir has contracted with, for a long time, the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon, the FBI, George Tenet, Condoleezza Rice have been advisors to the company. So this is a deep state guy. For fans of the Bilderberg Group, Peter Thiel is a member of the steering committee there. It says so on their website. The idea that because this guy is like good on wokeness and the culture war, and I don't think we'd agree with his immigration policy, but the paleos certainly do, and they like this idea of they're anti-free trade. That's kind of the thing now with a lot of these guys. And so they like the idea of these policies of decoupling and becoming, more self-sustaining and building up manufacturing here. I mean, they argue that, Blake Masters will argue that if you want to fight inflation, you have to build factories here and make more and more of our goods here at home. But I mean, the fact is, I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, if you just economically, if you can get cheaper, and high quality goods from China, then spending more to make them and to build all the new factories. I mean, it doesn't really make sense on its face. But see, these guys don't talk about the Asia pivot, or if they do, they endorse it in the case of like Joe Kemp, because all of his policies sort of line up with it. It's not as if he's saying, I want to see more warships and more warplanes in the South China Sea, and we should be sending 2 warships through the Taiwan Strait every month instead of just 1. They don't have to do that. But in the absence of discussing that, and you have people who are connected like this to the deep state, of course they're going to tell you some things that you like. But I brought this up, and I was referred to, the guy said that, you're just being an autistic L, which I'm glad to accept that criticism, because I am focused much more on foreign policy than these people. So to me, that issue is, paramount. And I'm just not going to get on board with anybody who's a hawk, and on like DeSantis is on Iran and is an Israel firster and an anti-China guy. I have no interest in that, in giving that guy more power. I appreciate the fact that for political purposes he was anti-COVID regime when it was expedient, but as Pat has discussed, and you'll see, I've gotten a sneak peek at that article. This is a guy who believes in government by emergency and taking, all kinds of powers in surveying people's medical records and all kinds of things. So this is, and as you said, a big supporter of the surveillance state, et cetera. So, I'm sorry, I'm not throwing my principles out the window to be as part of a larger coalition with the right. I also think that a big problem here is that there is kind of a romanticism to this idea that, oh, the right has learned it, it's changed its ways. They're anti-war now. Isn't that just so beautiful? And it's a nice narrative, but these people don't, like I said, they don't want to end all the aid to Israel. They don't want to stop occupying Syria. They don't want to lift sanctions on Iran. They don't want to stop the Asia pivot. And like Kyle was saying, if these guys were like great on COVID and all these things, and they just happened to be and good on, let's say, other freedom and liberty issues, but they just wanted to reduce the trade deficit with China, build more manufacturing goods here at home, and had some sort of protectionist, whatever, leftist policy. I'd hate that and think it was stupid, but I might vote for them if they were sincerely anti-war. I don't vote, by the way, but if they were actually talking about pulling all the troops, leaving NATO, ending the Asia pivot, rolling back our domination and, occupation of these countries and ending the war in Yemen and these sorts of things, and they really meant it and getting our troops out of Africa, then I would actually sincerely consider supporting them and like publicly so. But, that's just not what you're getting. And in fact, these guys, if they are not, they're saying decouple, and they support or just don't have any position on the Asia pivot. So people can laugh at like my concerns like this guy did and go like, oh yeah, I think he wants to nuke Beijing. You're like, well, look at the policies. Look at Joe Kent's campaign page. The guy's an absolute hawk. And they've taken this kind of Trump narrative. Like the idea is that Trump is anti-war. So people just sort of accept that, and they accept that the right liked him, so they must be anti-war. But you look at how they've modified his rhetoric. They're worse on NATO than he is, but because they say America first, they go, well, I'm America first. And I believe we should expand the Abraham Accords and strengthen NATO and, make sure and cut off Europe from Russian gas and, stop Nord Stream 2, but our allies should pay more of their fair share. And you see people like Josh Hawley. Daniel Larison just wrote a great piece about him called "The China Hawks Aren't Anti-War" at antiwar.com. Everybody should read it. And Larison points out that, Hawley's whole thing is like, I wouldn't be against bringing Ukraine into NATO and starting World War III if our allies were paying more money into the alliance. But really, in the absence of that, I just feel like we're losing resources. And what we really need to do is expand our footprint in the Indo-Pacific for our inevitable confrontation with China. And so, I see most of this as like a massive transparent con, and it's kind of absurd to watch this train wreck happening where everybody acts like it's not happening, and there's this encouragement to just kind of go along because the right wing is starting to like us. They don't think we're like gay LP libertarians anymore, and we're not what's her name? Who was the former candidate that everybody hated for her BLM stance?
Oh, Jo Jorgensen.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's just everybody feels like they have to mop up her mess because everybody is like, I don't want to be, a woke LP blue check. I don't like the LP. The LP today, after Biden's speech, said, Taiwan is a country, period, which is the worst possible state. Like, if I was trying to like make them look as unappealing as possible, I probably still wouldn't have come up with a tweet that bad. And so, yeah. So, I'm totally not for them. I'm not a member of the LP. I support Dave Smith because he was influential on me, especially early on when I started listening to his show years and years ago. And I know Scott is his right-hand man, and that's good enough for me to want to see that guy become as successful as possible in his endeavors. And I think we've seen some proof of concept with his, particularly with that video about the war in Yemen on his most recent Rogan experience. But I would like to see a lot more of that. And I hope that people are realizing that you won't differentiate yourself by just being good on COVID like all these other right wingers. What you really need to do is go on these shows like Tim Pool, if you have access to these platforms, or Joe Rogan, and push back on the anti-China propaganda and push back on all the other war propaganda and make foreign policy the leading issue. Because a lot of things appeal to people about Trump, and a lot of things appeal to people about Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul. But the through line of a lot of the genuine Tea Party movement, the sort of Occupy movement, and the I think largely it's sort of an anti-establishment / anti-war sentiment that's very strong in America. And I think we can actually come together on a lot of issues. And the most unifying thing from the best parts of the right, the best parts of the left, and the best parts of the libertarian movement is being anti-war. And I think it's a winning issue. And I think we've seen with the success of that clip that people are hungry for that. I mean, there's a lot of people who are against the COVID regime at this point, but people making that kind of a statement about what's, a genocide being committed in our name, on our dime in Yemen, mass murdering babies by the, thousands, hundreds of thousands, that is something the American people need to hear, and they would love to oppose it if they knew about it. They would absolutely. My belief is that they would make sure that it stops. But there's not enough people bringing attention to it, and it gets sidelined in favor of culture war issues. And that's very dangerous, because the more we become as just wanting to be like a sidekick to the right, especially in this sort of new quasi-independent media climate, it makes us much more invested in the culture war. When, I remember when they said that the whole point of this Mises Caucus thing was that we were going to rise above the culture war, and that we were going to talk about the issues, and namely foreign policy, corporate welfare, the Federal Reserve, the police state, and the COVID regime. And I'd like to see more of that. I don't think we need to make these people really like us. I think we need to tell people the truth. And I think that's what Ron Paul did. And I think that's why he was so successful.
Right. I completely agree. And it does seem like it's kind of going that way. And I think that's a lot of the reason why Joe Jorgensen got hit so hard, is because we're trying to ally with this political right, and she went on the complete other side of this culture war issue. And she did kind of walk back the tweet. But I mean, I completely understand why people raked her over the coals for that, because it's like, look, you're stepping into this in a time where this is incredibly unpopular, with the George Floyd riots and all this stuff going on. And you're going to say that, and you're not going to condemn the riots and everything like way prior. Like, you were literally blowing your entire leg off. Forget shooting your foot. You just blew your whole freaking leg off by doing something like that. So I'm interested in seeing how things kind of go moving forward, because here in Pennsylvania, we do have what I think is a strong libertarian party, as in we have a lot of elected officials. Now, not like huge seats, like we have mayors and auditors, constables, shit like that. But I think the potential is definitely here for a bigger libertarian movement. And I'll be the first one to say, if these guys aren't sold on all the issues that they need to be sold on, then if there's better Republicans, then, get the fuck out of there. I'm voting for the Republicans over you if you're not going to be a good libertarian. But yeah, I think that we shouldn't water down the message of, that Ron Paul libertarian message just for the sake of gaining political capital with people. Because then, if you sell your soul to the devil, then, is it really worth what you get in return? And especially if it's going to be a hot war with China.
No, I totally agree. And I'll just say the thing about the BLM, I totally agree with you about the riots, and that was a horrible political decision. And, I'm not condoning any of that, what was happening in the George Floyd riots or the LP position. I'm just saying, I don't feel like it's my responsibility to make Tim Pool like us by trying to be more like him and appealing to his audience, who, when Scott Horton went on his show and was just saying, we shouldn't go to war with China, and combating from an anti-interventionist position, which you could take, what he was saying should appeal to real conservatives in the anti-war paleo-conservative tradition, or the libertarians. But those people all called him a communist. And shortly, I don't know if it was right after, but I mean, that show is designed to deliver propaganda about foreign states. I mean, this is a guy who runs around saying Putin wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. When he talks about China, he has on, Steve Bannon, Falun Gong, Yamini Park to talk about North Korea. And so it's just, it's pretty transparent. But I think, again, like Pat said, a lot of people have this idea that, like, well, I don't want to rock the boat too much because that's such a huge platform. And if I can get on there, oh boy, we could spread the message. But you're diluting the message when you don't see. I think that if somebody went on there like Scott and Pete did, and that was heroic, but we should see more of that. I mean, because that is what wins. I think that's what wins people over. Because
it's the lion's den.
Yeah, you got to tell the truth. That's what Ron Paul did in the debates. About the famous blowback moment with Giuliani, the reason people love that, he got booed in the audience. The audience hated it. they thought he was a traitor and God knows what, but he told the absolute truth and reminded them that, we killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis during Bill Clinton's era, and we're occupying these people's holy land, and they don't like us. I don't know if he mentioned the Palestine issue, but certainly the occupations of Palestine and our support for Israel's war on southern Lebanon. But yeah, I mean, those are hard truths and hard pills for people to swallow, but they need them. Once they take them, then that's, everybody says, oh, the red pill moment, well, that's what that is. And it condensed to its, purest form. It's just telling people hard truths that they need to know, and they'll be very grateful. And people, turned anti-war because of Ron Paul, or turned libertarian because of Ron Paul. You're kind of different for the rest of your life. I mean, you may choose, like us, to really make it your life's work and to dedicate yourself to it. And I think that a lot, the best figures in our movement and the people coming up and our colleagues and us, and we all have something to contribute. And, our job is not to make ourselves more appealing to more people by not really touching on the subjects that are unpopular, really focusing on the subjects where there's a lot of agreement. I think that's a recipe for making ourselves irrelevant.
Well, yeah, I definitely couldn't agree more. And I tend to see that a lot with people just trying to play to everybody's interests at the time and trying to be, right on every single issue all the time, or, maybe go with the right wing narrative just so that way you can gain political capital with these people. You guys got anything else to add, or do you want to kind of sum up and rock and roll?
Well, the last thing I'll say about Tim Pool, I guess, just a final shot here. He had a video coming out today where he said, I did not think that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. And we were talking about hawks in sheep's clothing. Connor, you were talking about that. And that's exactly what it is. It's like the cheese in the trap for people that think like us is cloaking things in, oh, I would never support a war. Tim has said things like that. And then he literally projects the same narrative as John Bolton. I mean, you could compare tweets and statements to what John Bolton says, but if he says, hey, now I don't think we should go to war, but, when World War II happened, we didn't stop Hitler and he rolled through the Sudetenland and then Poland and all this stuff. And that's what Putin's doing. And then Tim Pool says that he didn't think that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. He announced the invasion 2 days before it happened.
They know what they're doing.
And yeah. So I mean, just those things is that it really, and it doesn't seem like anyone really calls him out on it, because and these things just have to be said. It's like, I know that I've gone after Tim a lot, but he's so influential on libertarianism, and people wanting to try and, that's not the right word, but people really trying to get on his show and make inroads with him. But yeah, it's just dressing everything up, and the anti-COVID stuff is the cheese in the trap, I think. And then when you, it's like I think Caitlin Johnstone had a dig at the Young Turks because they were saying, oh, we're anti-war, we're anti-war, and she went on Twitter and it's like, well, when you carry every regime talking point and then at the end claim that you're anti-war, I don't really buy that. And I'm sure she used more colorful language than that because that's her style. But yeah, it's just it's really infuriating, and then when people call him out on it for fear mongering, he says, hey man, like, I'm just reading the news. It's not, but when you read the corporate press and the deep state talking points and then don't explore the other side or do any kind of fact checking, like, you just are carrying their narrative and you're packaging it in a way for people who go to Tim Pool thinking that they're getting something other than the mainstream media. It's the same damn thing. It's just wrapped in a different package, and you get more convinced of it because it's in a longer format. And really, when you boil it down, Tim doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about.
And because they don't have like thousands of dollars of clothes on them, and he wears the same shitty outfit every day. So it's like, oh, wow, this guy's like a real journalist.
Yeah. Kyle?
Yeah, all right. So I'll try to make this quick, but I think if you check out my article on Yemen that I wrote about Dave Smith on Rogan, and then Corey Mills taking a shot at Smith on Tim Pool, you'll kind of get to like some of my frustration and just kind of point out that you have all these people pretend to be anti-interventionists. He goes, I'm an anti-interventionist, and then proceeds to repeat every hawkish talking point there is on Yemen. And it's absolutely infuriating. And so I mean that's a big thing. And just like, we have so much stuff going on right now, and obviously the situation in Ukraine is very serious, and I'm not trying to like downplay it and say that there's nothing going on there. And obviously, unlike the war between or the war in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and everything like that dropping bombs, there's no risk of nuclear war there. There's no risk anything could ever come to the United States of America. But that's not really the case in Ukraine. Like, there is that kind of like, it could potentially go really, really wrong. At the same time, the fighting there like isn't the most horrific thing. If anybody has seen any kind of footage of the past couple of years from Syria, Tigray, Libya, Mali, Yemen, Myanmar, none of them are, compared to what's coming out of Ukraine, is not that ugly of a at least not yet. Now, we could wake up in a couple of days and it could be really, really ugly. There's just so much like need right now for everybody to go, oh, we gotta say bad things about Putin and anybody. And it's like, okay, but you don't feel this compulsion to constantly do that with the American government, right? Like, there's no need to constantly be like, oh, this person locked down, and the treatment of Black Americans and things like that. Like, nobody talks about any kind of it's just, oh, China's terrible about their human rights abuses, but I mean, they're pretty bad in America too. We run a torture prison on the Cuban island. Dick Cheney paid two psychiatrists $80 million to torture people, and those people still have that money and are free men. Like, that's pretty serious too. Like, there's a lot of American stuff to talk about here. And so I don't know, it's all very frustrating because I feel like the libertarian movement has so many of its roots in the Ron Paul revolution, and that was largely based on being anti-war and being good on foreign policy. And so many of the like people that came from that movement are very good on like the Iraq war and things like that. But it's become very clear that a large portion of the libertarian movement has lost all interest in foreign policy. And this was the case well before COVID, but it's really becoming an issue now, and just have no even instincts on how to react to a lot of these issues, and end up taking very hawkish positions. That's why the LP is tweeting out Taiwan is a country. It's because they have no concept of the history of that, right? And it's extremely frustrating, and aligning ourselves with the DeSantis's of the world is just going in the wrong direction.
And one thing I think is important too, and this is praising you and Connor, you want to talk about living in Ancapistan in your head. Like, studying foreign policy is the exact opposite of that. These are real world situations with real world consequences. I mean, this is where theory meets the road. And I don't know, man. It's difficult. It's a difficult subject area.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Connor, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, as a final note, I with the sort of the Tim Pool thing and these people who kind of, it's very dangerous, because the truth is, if you want to focus on foreign policy, be very wise for people to start reading real independent media. One of the best ways to do that is to read antiwar.com and click through Kyle's viewpoints, and you'll find a lot of sites and a lot of journalists who are very good on these issues. And you can, I mean, the thing about antiwar.com, it's sort of like the Mises Institute in the sense of, if you are just, a regular guy or a regular girl who wants to learn about foreign policy and learn a lot about it, and you could do it. If you read antiwar.com and you read Dave DeCamp and Jason Ditz and now Kyle's articles there, and you listen to the Scott Horton show and you listen to Conflicts of Interest and you read the viewpoints, you could very quickly become really good on foreign policy. because, you know, I mean, it's highly curated with the best sources. And what Tim Pool does by having it designed where he's, you know, just reading off mainstream, I mean, it literally is almost like if I was to put somebody out there to subvert the independent media, I would use somebody like Tim Pool to do it. And unfortunately, you have a lot of very people who are respected, you know, across the spectrum who say, you know, this guy's great. If you want to be, you know, informed and know about the news, you'll listen to this show. And that's just not true. And so, no, I totally agree. And I think that a lot of people should be focusing on foreign policy. I think arguably Ron Paul, as much as he led with and the Fed, I think foreign policy was probably at least 51% the issue. I mean, always. I mean, the idea that whenever he was talking about ending welfare programs and all these things that we want to do, ultimately, he always said, you got to bring the troops home first and you got to end the wars and you got to stop killing people and you got to stop spending all this money. We don't have it. We're broke. And it's very, very, I mean, he was opposing NATO expansion and these, you know, the encroachments on Russia and arms control issues on the debate stage during the Ron Paul revolution. These are issues that the libertarian movement should be leading with, because there's nobody else who's as good on these issues as us. As much as I love the real left and the real paleoconservative right, libertarians, because of our philosophy, are able to be, I think, honestly, I think we have an edge on this issue. And there really is no competition when it comes to, you know, if we wanted to be the leaders of the anti-war movement, I think we could absolutely do it. And sites like antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute are at the forefront of that. And so, I mean, I guess those are my closing thoughts, but that should be the main, I really do think that should be our main focus. And I think it's the best way to differentiate ourselves right now.
And a lot of people from across the anti-war spectrum of all political persuasions read antiwar.com. I mean, the multipolarity of that website can't be overstated.
Yep.
Cool. Kyle, closing thoughts?
No, that's all I got. Great job, guys. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. This was awesome. I would love to do it again sometime. I think this was really valuable, and I think I'm probably gonna have to listen to this a few times just so I make sure that I got the most out of this. But yeah, you guys are awesome, and like I said, we'll have to do it again sometime. So you know, where can everybody find you guys before we get out of here?
libertarianinstitute.org. Antiwar.com.
Yep.
Same here.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, until next time, everybody take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle.